She thought she had all the power. She thought no one could challenge her authority. But when a flight attendant slapped a crying toddler mid-flight, she had no idea the boy's father owned the entire airline. Within minutes, the plane wasn't just landing. It was her career crashing down. And the moment she realized who she had crossed, it was already too late. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, its cabin filled with the low hum of engines and quiet conversations. Most passengers had settled into their seats, some watching movies, others dozing off. Near the middle of the aircraft, Amira sat holding her toddler, rocking him gently in her arms. Cairo, her 2-year-old son, whimpered softly, shifting uncomfortably. She rubbed his back, whispering soothing words, hoping he would drift off to sleep. He wasn't screaming, wasn't throwing a tantrum, just restless, like any child on a long flight. A few rows away, Ms. Whitmore, a senior flight attendant with neatly pinned blonde hair and a sharp, rigid posture, stood near the galley, her eyes scanning the cabin. She had worked these flights for years and prided herself on maintaining order. To her, first class was a place of quiet, where well-mannered passengers sat without disruption. Her gaze landed on the child, the fidgeting, the soft whining. It irritated her. She sighed, smoothing down her uniform before stepping forward, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way toward them. Stopping beside their row, she folded her arms, looking down at Amira with a tight smile that barely masked her impatience. "Ma'am, you need to keep him quiet. The passengers are trying to relax," she said, her voice firm but not loud enough to draw attention. Amira looked up, her expression weary but polite. "I'm trying," she replied, adjusting Cairo in her lap. "He's just tired." Ms. Whitmore let out a small sigh as if she had heard every excuse in the book. "Try harder," she muttered. Amira's lips parted, but before she could say anything, Cairo shifted again, his small foot brushing against Ms. Whitmore's skirt. It wasn't a kick, just an innocent movement, barely enough to be noticed. But the woman stiffened as if she had been personally offended. Without a second thought, she reached down, grabbed the child's tiny wrist and smacked his hand lightly. "Enough," she snapped. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to make Cairo flinch, his whimper turning into a sharp cry. Enough to make Amira freeze in shock, staring at Ms. Whitmore with wide eyes. Enough to make the entire row of passengers turn their heads, stunned into silence. For a moment, the plane felt unnaturally still. No one spoke. Amira's grip on her son tightened as she pulled him closer, her heart pounding. Ms. Whitmore, seemingly unfazed, straightened her posture, smoothing down her uniform again as if nothing had happened. "Teach your child some discipline," she muttered under her breath before turning on her heel, walking back up the aisle without another glance. A few passengers exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said a word. Some turned their attention back to their screens, pretending they hadn't witnessed it. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Amira, still frozen, felt a rush of anger and disbelief washing over her. Her son had simply been restless. He wasn't misbehaving. And yet, a stranger, someone who was supposed to be in charge of passenger comfort, had just laid a hand on him. She took a slow, shaky breath, trying to gather herself. She wanted to speak up, to demand an explanation, but before she could even open her mouth, a voice from 2 rows ahead cut through the tension. "What did you just do?" The words were calm, controlled, but they carried weight. Passengers turned, heads swiveling toward the man who had spoken. Zayden Gray had been quiet the entire flight, seated with a business magazine in his lap, but now his sharp gaze was locked onto Ms. Whitmore. She barely spared him a glance. "The child was disruptive," she said coolly, her hands clasped in front of her, as if she had simply corrected a minor problem. Zayden didn't react immediately. He took his time, setting his magazine aside, unbuckling his seatbelt, and standing up. Ms. Whitmore still wasn't looking at him, too focused on adjusting a tray in the galley. But the moment she finally turned her head and saw his face, the color drained from hers. Passengers whispered among themselves, realization rippling through the crowd. One man muttered under his breath, "That's him. That's the owner." Ms. Whitmore's throat went dry. Her mind raced. It couldn't be. She had seen the first-class list, had checked the names. He wasn't listed there. He had to be a regular passenger. But there was no mistaking him. Zayden took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. "You put your hands on my son." And just like that, the entire flight shifted. The weight of those 7 words, "You put your hands on my son," hung in the air like a brewing storm. The tension in the cabin was thick, passengers holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Ms. Whitmore's eyes flickered with panic, but she masked it quickly, straightening her posture as if she still had control of the situation. "Sir, I assure you, there was no harm intended," she said, her voice quieter now, losing its usual sharpness. "I was simply addressing a disturbance." "A disturbance?" Zayden cut her off, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something controlled and dangerous. "You just hit a child. My child." Amira felt her pulse quicken as she turned to look at Zayden, finally realizing the full extent of who he was. She had known her husband was an influential businessman, but he never flaunted his wealth or status. He preferred to experience flights like any other passenger, to understand what his customers went through. But now, standing in the middle of the aisle with his presence commanding the entire cabin, there was no mistaking the authority he carried. Ms. Whitmore's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. The shift in energy had happened so fast. 1 second she was enforcing rules, keeping control, and the next, she was caught in a situation she couldn't escape. "I understand your concern, Mr." She trailed off, pretending as if she didn't already know his name. Zayden's gaze didn't waver. "Gray." That single name sent another wave of murmurs through the cabin. A man seated nearby turned to his wife and whispered, "That's Zayden Gray. He owns this airline." Ms. Whitmore's fingers twitched at her sides, her lips parting slightly as the realization fully hit her. He wasn't just some executive sitting on the board. He was the CEO, the man at the very top. The man who had the power to decide her entire future with one phone call. Passengers were fully alert now, no longer pretending to ignore the situation. Some discreetly pulled out their phones, not recording but checking the airline's website, confirming for themselves that the man now standing in front of them was indeed their employer's employer. Ms. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably, trying to regain control. I didn't realize, sir. Had I known?" "That shouldn't matter." Amira's voice came through, quieter than Zayden's but filled with just as much authority. "You don't get to decide who deserves kindness. You don't get to lay hands on someone's child just because you think they don't belong here." Ms. Whitmore flinched. The words hit their mark. Her eyes darted around, searching for support, but none of the other flight attendants dared to intervene. They stood frozen, watching from the galley, unsure if stepping in would make things better or worse. Zayden exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose as if he were keeping himself from saying something he'd regret. Then, without another word, he turned his head toward the front of the plane, locking eyes with one of the other attendants. "Get me the captain," he said. And just like that, Ms. Whitmore's entire world started to crumble. A nervous hush fell over the cabin. The request for the captain wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Passengers exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats, others staring at Ms. Whitmore, waiting to see how she would respond. The color had drained from her face, but she stood frozen, as if hoping the moment would pass. It wouldn't. One of the younger flight attendants, Noelle, hesitated before stepping forward. She glanced at Ms. Whitmore briefly, then at Zayden. Without a word, she nodded and hurried toward the front of the aircraft. The tension thickened. Ms. Whitmore opened her mouth, desperate to control the narrative. "Sir, I don't think we need to escalate this," she said quickly. "This was simply a misunderstanding." Zayden's sharp gaze snapped back to her. You think this is a misunderstanding. His voice was lower now, quieter, but the edge in it made her flinch. You put your hands on a child who did nothing wrong. You humiliated my wife in front of an entire cabin, and now you're trying to talk your way out of it? Ms. Whitmore swallowed hard, struggling to keep her composure. I wasn't aware of his status, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped Zayden. His status? He shook his head, his expression unreadable. So if my son was just another passenger, that would have made it okay. Amira tightened her grip on Cairo, who had calmed down but still clung to her. She had been watching silently, letting Zayden take the lead. But now she spoke again, her voice clear. You thought no one would care. You thought we wouldn't matter. Ms. Whitmore said nothing. She didn't have an answer. The soft click of a door opening made heads turn. Captain Reed, a man in his late 40s with neatly combed brown hair and an air of quiet authority, stepped into the cabin. He took one look at the tension-filled space, his eyes landing on Zayden first, then flicking toward Ms. Whitmore, who had gone stiff. What's going on here? His voice was even, but there was a hint of urgency in his tone. Zayden turned toward him, his jaw tight. Your lead flight attendant thought it was appropriate to put her hands on my child. Captain Reed's brow furrowed slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. He shifted his gaze to Ms. Whitmore, his expression unreadable. Is that true? She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time, she looked truly afraid. She had been with the airline for years, had built a career she was proud of. She had never imagined making one mistake that could unravel everything in mere minutes. I may have misjudged the situation, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. A heavy silence followed. Zayden exhaled slowly, shaking his head. That's the best you can do. Captain Reed straightened his posture. Mr. Gray, I assure you, this will be handled appropriately. He turned toward Noel. Get me a direct line to operations, now. Noel nodded and disappeared back into the cockpit. Ms. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly at her sides. She had lost control of the situation, and she knew it. But what terrified her most was that the worst had yet to come. The cabin remained unnervingly still, the weight of the moment pressing down like a storm about to break. Ms. Whitmore stood rigid, her fingers twitching as Captain Reed gave her a long, assessing look. Noel had already disappeared into the cockpit, and Zayden, arms crossed over his chest, didn't bother to look at her anymore. His focus was now on Amira and Cairo, his hand resting protectively on the toddler's back. Ms. Whitmore opened her mouth, desperate to salvage her position. Captain, He raised a hand, cutting her off. Not another word. His tone left no room for argument. He turned toward Zayden. Mr. Gray, I understand this is an unacceptable situation. I need to ask, what course of action would you like to take? Ms. Whitmore's breath hitched. Her heart pounded as she realized the power had completely shifted out of her hands. Whatever came next was no longer up to her. It was up to the man she had just wronged. Zayden didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, his fingers tapping against his forearm as he thought. The silence stretched, making Ms. Whitmore's nerves fray with each passing second. Then finally, he spoke. She's done. 2 words. Calm, measured, but absolute. Ms. Whitmore's stomach twisted. Sir, please, she whispered, her voice cracking. I've worked for this airline for years, and you just threw it all away, Amira said coldly, her voice cutting through the flight attendant's weak plea. You don't get to hurt my son and ask for sympathy. The cockpit door opened again, and Noel reappeared, holding out the in-flight phone. Operations is on the line, Captain. Captain Reed nodded, taking the receiver. He turned slightly away, listening to the voice on the other end. Ms. Whitmore tried to hear what was being said, but the pounding of her pulse drowned out everything else. A few passengers had begun murmuring now, sensing that something bigger was unfolding. Some still pretended to ignore it, shifting in their seats. but others were fully engaged, their eyes flickering between Zayden, Amira, and the terrified flight attendant who had once carried herself with so much authority. Captain Reed finally turned back, lowering the phone. His face was unreadable, but the way he squared his shoulders made it clear that a decision had been made. "Ms. Whitmore," he said evenly, "you are relieved of duty, effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the cabin. Ms. Whitmore stumbled back a step. No, you can't." Zayden raised a brow. "I just did." Captain Reed nodded once, his voice firm. "You will remain seated in the crew area until we land. Upon arrival, you will be escorted off the aircraft for a full review." Ms. Whitmore's breath came in shallow bursts. The humiliation was unbearable. She had been the one giving orders, the one making the rules. And now, she was the one being dismissed like an unruly passenger. She turned, as if looking for someone, anyone, to defend her. The other flight attendants avoided her gaze. They had seen the entire thing unfold, and none of them wanted to be associated with her downfall. The captain's voice snapped her back to reality. "Ms. Whitmore." She turned slowly. "Sit down," he said, his tone final. Defeated, she took a shaky step back and dropped into the nearest crew seat, her hands clenched into fists on her lap, her mind spinning. Zayden exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his blazer. "Now that we've taken care of that," he said, looking at Captain Reed, "I expect a full incident report by the time we land." "Yes, sir," the captain responded without hesitation. Ms. Whitmore's nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The plane's steady hum filled the cabin, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Passengers who had been watching the confrontation quickly turned back to their screens or looked out the windows, pretending they hadn't witnessed the downfall of the once authoritative flight attendant. Others stole glances toward Ms. Whitmore, whose face was pale as she sat stiffly in the crew seat, staring at nothing. Zayden took his seat again, his arm draping protectively around Amira and Cairo. His son, still nestled against his mother's chest, had finally started to settle. The tension that had gripped Amira's shoulders eased, though her fingers still lightly traced circles on Cairo's back. She wasn't sure whether she was relieved or still in shock at how quickly things had escalated. A soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." Amira and Zayden looked up. Noelle, the younger flight attendant, stood beside them, her hands clasped in front of her. She had hesitated before approaching, unsure if she was overstepping, but she felt compelled to speak. "I just wanted to say," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that what happened back there, it wasn't right. I was uncomfortable when I saw it, and I should have spoken up sooner." She looked at Amira with quiet remorse. "I'm really sorry for what you went through." Amira studied the woman for a moment. There was sincerity in her eyes, genuine regret. Zayden nodded once. "It's not your fault. But you saw what happened. You know this wasn't just about my son making noise, don't you?" Noelle's face tightened. "Yes, sir." Amira let out a slow breath, her voice calmer now. "Then promise me this. If you ever see something like this again, don't wait for someone else to speak up." Noelle swallowed hard and nodded. "I won't." A few feet away, Ms. Whitmore stiffened at the exchange, but she didn't dare interrupt. Her place in the cabin had shifted. She was no longer in control, no longer the enforcer of rules. She was just another passenger now, waiting to see what her future held. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are in the upright position. Flight attendants will be making their final cabin check shortly." Zayden shifted slightly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his knee. Amira noticed the subtle motion, one she had seen before. He was thinking, calculating his next move. She leaned toward him. "What are you planning?" He turned his head, meeting her eyes with an expression that was impossible to read. "You'll see." Ms. Whitmore caught that last part, her pulse quickening. She had thought the worst had passed. that she would be escorted off the plane in silence, left to explain herself to airline management. But something in Zayden's tone sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't over, not yet. The descent felt slower than usual, or maybe it was just the weight pressing down on Ms. Whitmore's chest. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, her mind racing through possible outcomes. Would they fire her immediately? Would there be a meeting? Could she talk her way out of this? She stole a glance toward Zayden, hoping to read his expression, but he hadn't spared her another look. He was focused on Amira and Cairo, adjusting the toddler's blanket while speaking to his wife in hushed tones. Whatever he had planned, it wasn't meant for her ears. Passengers around them were quietly fastening their seatbelts, some sneaking discreet glances toward the front of the plane where Captain Reed sat stiffly in his seat, waiting for the final instructions from air traffic control. Then the intercom crackled again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Noel and the other attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts and securing trays. But the energy felt different. No one looked at Ms. Whitmore. No one acknowledged her. It was as if she had already been erased from their team. The landing gear rumbled beneath them as the plane began its final approach. Ms. Whitmore exhaled, pressing her palms against her lap to steady herself. Maybe, just maybe, she could talk to the airline executives before Zayden did. Maybe if she got ahead of this, she could. A sharp ding interrupted her thoughts. Passengers turned as a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane, waiting near the jet bridge. His stance was firm, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here for a routine check. He was waiting for someone. Ms. Whitmore's pulse skyrocketed. Her fingers curled around the armrest. This was happening faster than she thought. The plane's wheels touched down with a smooth but heavy thud, rolling down the runway before gradually slowing. The moment they reached the gate, another announcement came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we have reached the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off." A pause. Then the captain spoke again, but this time his voice held something different. "Certain crew members will be required to remain on board for further instructions. Passengers, we thank you for choosing our airline and wish you a pleasant stay." The words sent a ripple of whispers through the cabin. Ms. Whitmore's stomach twisted painfully. Certain crew members. She didn't need to be told. She knew exactly who that meant. Her hands trembled as she unfastened her seatbelt, her breath shallow. She had spent years walking through this terminal with authority, head held high. But now, she would be walking out under very different circumstances. And the worst part? She still didn't know what Zayden Gray had planned. The seatbelt sign flicked off with a soft chime, and the usual sounds of landing filled the cabin. Passengers shifting in their seats, overhead bins clicking open, and the faint hum of conversation as people prepared to disembark. But amidst the routine movements, an unsettling energy lingered in the air. People weren't just eager to leave the plane. They were waiting for something. Ms. Whitmore sat frozen in her seat, her hands clammy against her uniform. The security officer stood by the front exit, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the cabin like he had been given strict instructions. She knew better than to assume this was just protocol. He was waiting for her. Zayden remained in his seat, calm and unreadable, one arm resting around Amira, while his free hand lightly traced Cairo's back. He wasn't in a rush to leave. He had time, and that made Ms. Whitmore's stomach turn even more. The first-class passengers were allowed to exit first, many moving quickly, glancing toward the tense scene but saying nothing. A few cast quiet, judgmental looks in Ms. Whitmore's direction. Others simply averted their gaze, pretending this wasn't happening. One by one, the rows emptied. Then, finally, Captain Reed stood, adjusting his uniform before turning toward Ms. Whitmore. "You'll remain seated until further notice," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Ms. Whitmore could barely nod. Zayden finally moved, standing with a slow, deliberate ease, adjusting his blazer as he reached for his carry-on. Amira stood beside him, gently lifting Cairo, who was half asleep against her shoulder. Noel quickly stepped forward to help with their bags, but Zayden held up a hand, stopping her. "We've got it," he said. Noelle stepped back, nodding. Ms. Whitmore swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she realized Zayden was about to leave. Maybe this was it. Maybe he would walk away, let the airline handle it from here. Maybe she had a chance to explain herself, to find a way to salvage. Then he turned toward the security officer. "Escort her," he said simply. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The officer nodded. "Yes, sir." Ms. Whitmore's breath hitched. "Sir, not Mr. Gray. Not sir as a general courtesy. That was the way someone addressed a man who had given a direct order." Passengers who were still exiting slowed, some outright stopping near the jet bridge as they sensed the shift in power. The weight of Zayden's authority had settled over the plane, unspoken but undeniable. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman making a complaint. He was in control. Ms. Whitmore's voice barely came out. "Mr. Gray, please." Zayden turned his head slightly, giving her his full attention for the first time since she had been relieved of duty. She saw nothing in his expression. No anger, no triumph, no sympathy. That terrified her more than anything. Then, with a final glance toward Captain Reed, he spoke once more. "Make sure she's held accountable." And with that, he stepped off the plane, Amira beside him, Cairo still peacefully asleep in her arms. Ms. Whitmore's breath came in shallow gasps as the security officer finally stepped toward her, standing just inches away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice neutral, "you need to come with me." She didn't move right away. Her hands tightened into fists as she looked around, but there was no one left to help her, no one to back her up. Noelle averted her gaze. Captain Reed simply sighed. Passengers had already moved on. For years she had commanded this space, enforcing rules, making sure people knew she was in charge. But now, she wasn't even a flight attendant anymore. With no other choice, she slowly stood, her legs trembling beneath her. And with every step she took toward the front of the plane, she knew this wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the end of everything. The walk toward the exit felt longer than any flight Ms. Whitmore had ever worked. Her usually confident stride was gone, replaced with slow, uneasy steps as the security officer led her forward. The stares of the remaining passengers burned into her back, whispers growing louder as she moved. She kept her head down, her nails digging into her palms. If she could just make it past the jet bridge, past the terminal, maybe, just maybe, she could figure out a way to fix this. But deep down she knew this wasn't something she could fix. Zayden Gray hadn't yelled. He hadn't made a scene, but his silence had been more damning than any public outburst. He had let the situation unfold with quiet authority, and now she wasn't just facing company policy, she was facing him. She stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, the cool, sterile airport air hitting her like a slap. Just beyond the glass walls of the terminal, she saw passengers heading toward baggage claim, some glancing in her direction. The security officer stayed close, walking with measured steps, but he wasn't the one she feared. It was the man waiting just past the gate. Zayden stood near a row of sleek black chairs, speaking in hushed tones with a man in a tailored suit, one of the airline's senior executives. The executive nodded at whatever Zayden was saying, occasionally glancing toward the exit as if awaiting orders. Amira was a few steps away, adjusting Cairo's blanket as he dozed in her arms, her expression unreadable. Ms. Whitmore's heart pounded harder. This wasn't a private matter anymore. The executive team was involved. The security officer motioned for her to stop a few feet away, and she did, her throat dry. She had been hoping, praying that Zayden would simply walk away, let the airline handle things quietly. But the way he stood there, composed, speaking directly with someone high up, told her otherwise. He wasn't just lodging a complaint, he was making sure there were consequences. The executive turned toward her, his gaze sharp but unreadable. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice crisp. "Follow me." She hesitated, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Can I at least explain?" she asked, her voice weaker than she intended. Zayden finally turned to face her. "Explain what?" His tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking, but it was final. She opened her mouth, desperate to string together a defense, but the words wouldn't come. Because what could she say? That she hadn't meant to strike the child, that she had been overwhelmed, that she would never have done it if she had known who he was? All of it sounded hollow, even to her. The executive adjusted his tie. "You will have an opportunity to give your statement during the formal review," he said. "For now, you are to surrender your employee badge and credentials." Her breath hitched. "Wait, now?" "Yes," the executive said flatly. "Now." A slow horror settled over her as she realized how quickly this was happening. She had been on duty less than an hour ago, commanding the first-class cabin with authority. And now she wasn't even an employee anymore. Her hands shook as she reached for the lanyard around her neck, fumbling with the clip. The ID badge had been with her for years, worn like a symbol of status, proof that she belonged among the elite crew members. She had trained new attendants. She had enforced policies. She had believed she was untouchable. Now, she unhooked it from her uniform, her fingers trembling as she placed it into the executive's waiting hand. Passengers exiting the plane walked past them, some pretending not to watch, others sneaking glances as if they were witnessing a scandal unfold in real time. Ms. Whitmore's mouth felt dry. "And after this review?" she asked, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. Zayden adjusted his cuffs, watching her without a flicker of sympathy. "That depends on how honest you are." She swallowed hard. The executive gestured toward a set of double doors leading to the restricted employee areas. "Let's go." Ms. Whitmore hesitated for only a second before forcing her legs to move. She stole one last glance toward Zayden, hoping for something, anything that might indicate she still had a chance. But he had already turned away, his attention back on his wife and son, because to him, she wasn't worth his time anymore. And that realization hit harder than anything else. Ms. Whitmore walked through the double doors with the executive and security officer flanking her sides. The corridor was eerily quiet, sterile white walls and polished floors stretching ahead like a path to nowhere. Every step felt heavier, each click of her heels echoing in the silence. She had walked these halls before, many times actually, but never like this. She had always been the one leading others, training new flight attendants, enforcing policies. Now she was the one being led. The weight of it settled in her stomach like a rock. The executive, a tall man with graying hair and a sharp expression, didn't say much as they walked. He had introduced himself as Daniel Clark, one of the airline's senior directors, but there was no warmth in his tone, no hint of reassurance. He wasn't here to comfort her. He was here to handle a problem. And she was the problem. Finally, they reached a glass-walled conference room near the operations office. Daniel pushed the door open and gestured inside. "Take a seat." Ms. Whitmore hesitated but obeyed, lowering herself into the chair. The room was minimalist. Just a long table, a few chairs, and a large screen mounted on the wall. No decorations, no warmth, just business. Daniel sat across from her, setting her ID badge down on the table between them. The security officer remained by the door, arms crossed. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Daniel spoke. "You've been with this airline for over a decade, haven't you?" Ms. Whitmore nodded quickly, relieved that the conversation was starting with something neutral. "Yes, I've dedicated years to this company." "That's what makes this situation even worse," Daniel interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "You didn't just make a mistake. You showed blatant misconduct on a flight in front of dozens of passengers, and worst of all," he exhaled sharply, "you put your hands on the child of the airline's owner." Ms. Whitmore flinched. Hearing it out loud made it feel even worse than it already was. I wasn't thinking," she stammered. "I only meant to discipline him." Daniel's expression darkened. "Discipline?" He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Who gave you that authority?" Ms. Whitmore's lips parted, but she had no answer. "Let me make this clear," Daniel continued. "No flight attendant is ever permitted to physically discipline a passenger, least of all a child. I know, she whispered, her fingers tightening against the table's edge. I lost my patience. Daniel studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether he even cared about her reasoning. Then, slowly, he turned toward the screen on the wall. A click. The screen lit up. Her stomach dropped. A security feed. She watched in horror as the footage played, a silent but damning recording from the aircraft's in-cabin cameras. The angle was slightly tilted, capturing the moment perfectly. There she was, standing over Amira and Cairo. There was the impatient expression on her face. There was the sharp movement of her hand connecting with the toddler's tiny wrist. And then, the worst part, the way Amira froze, the shock written all over her face. The footage was undeniable. Ms. Whitmore's fingers curled into her lap. Daniel turned off the screen. So, what do you have to say now? She swallowed hard. It looks bad, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I wasn't thinking clearly. You weren't thinking at all, Daniel corrected. Ms. Whitmore's pulse raced. Please, she whispered, leaning forward. I've given this airline my entire career. I know I made a mistake, but this isn't just a mistake, Daniel interrupted again, his tone cold. This is liability. Ms. Whitmore's chest tightened. Zayden's words came back to her. Make sure she's held accountable. It hadn't been an empty threat, she was being held accountable. And it wasn't over yet. Daniel exhaled, pushing back his chair slightly. Here's what's going to happen next, he said. Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid suspension pending a full review. Ms. Whitmore sucked in a sharp breath. Suspension? Yes. Daniel's tone remained neutral. You will receive an official notice within 24 hours. A formal meeting with the board will be scheduled, and during that time your employment status will be decided. She gripped the table. Decided? Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Yes, but if you're looking for a guarantee that you'll keep your job, he shook his head. I wouldn't count on it. Her breath came in uneven gasps. Please, she whispered. I didn't mean... Daniel held up a hand. Save it. He nodded toward the security officer. Escort her out. Ms. Whitmore's vision blurred as she stood, the walls of the room closing in around her. She had spent years walking these halls with pride, her head held high, enforcing rules and keeping order. Now, she was being escorted out like a criminal. She followed the security officer through the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. Employees she had worked with for years passed by, some throwing her brief, knowing glances, others pretending not to see her at all. She felt humiliated, but more than that, she felt helpless. By the time she reached the exit doors, the reality of it all sank in. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This wasn't just an incident she could brush off. This was the end. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. The airport doors slid open, and the cold air hit Ms. Whitmore's skin like a slap. She hesitated at the threshold, blinking against the rush of reality. She wasn't an employee anymore, not in any official capacity. The security officer at her side didn't push her forward or hurry her along. He didn't need to. She knew she had no choice but to walk out on her own. For years, she had exited through these very doors after long-haul flights, feeling the satisfaction of a job well done. She had walked out with her uniform pressed and her head high, greeting crew members with brief nods as they parted ways. Now she walked out alone. The security officer didn't say a word. He simply stood at the entrance, watching as she took slow, uncertain steps toward the curb. A few employees near the terminal exit whispered amongst themselves, throwing her quick, knowing glances. Word had spread. That was the thing about airports. News traveled faster than any plane. Ms. Whitmore clenched her hands into fists, trying to suppress the storm brewing in her chest. She had been someone here, respected, feared even. And now? Now she was nothing but a former employee who had made the mistake of crossing the wrong person. No, she caught herself. That wasn't the real mistake. The real mistake had been her own actions. She could try to justify it all she wanted, call it exhaustion, a lapse in judgment, impatience. But none of it changed the fact that she had put her hands on a child. Not just any child, but the child of the most powerful man in the airline business. That was the thing about power. She had spent years wielding it, using it to control passengers, to keep order in her cabin, to demand respect. But power could be taken away just as easily as it was given. And now she had nothing. She reached into her pocket for her phone, her fingers shaking as she unlocked the screen. A flood of notifications greeted her. A missed call from a friend at the airline. A message from a coworker. What happened? Is it true? And worst of all, a new email from Human Resources. Her stomach churned as she opened it. Subject: Employment Status Update. From Airline HR Department, time 6:42 p.m. Dear Ms. Whitmore, this email is to confirm that you are currently on unpaid suspension pending further review by the airline's executive board. A formal hearing regarding your conduct on Flight 637 will be scheduled within the next 5 business days. Failure to comply with the investigation process will result in immediate termination. Additionally, please be advised that during this period, you are not permitted to access any airline properties, crew lounges, or company systems. Further instructions will be provided in a separate email. Regards, Airline HR Department. She stared at the words, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Unpaid suspension, pending review, formal hearing. She knew what that meant. They weren't reviewing anything. They were waiting for Zayden Gray's final decision. She had seen situations like this before. Attendants who had made poor choices, employees who had been called in for meetings, thinking they had a chance to argue their case, only to walk out jobless, a security escort at their side. She had been on the other side of those conversations. She had been the one whispering about it in break rooms, watching from a distance as someone disappeared from the crew schedule, their name erased as if they had never worked there at all. And now, she was next. Her breathing became shallow as she lowered her phone, staring blankly at the road ahead. The airport traffic moved as it always did. Taxis pulling up, families reuniting, pilots walking in and out of the terminal, ready to take on another flight. Everything was moving forward. But she was stuck. A sharp gust of wind blew against her, cutting through her uniform. Or, what had been her uniform. It wasn't hers anymore. The badge was gone. The title was gone. The power was gone. Her mind raced for a solution. Maybe she could plead her case at the review. Maybe she could write an apology to Zayden Gray himself. Would that even matter? Would he care? From the moment he had turned away from her in that conference room, she had felt it. He had already decided. The review was just a formality. She wasn't coming back from this. The thought made her dizzy. She had worked for 10 years to get to where she was. 10 years of flights, training, managing passengers, enforcing rules. She had dedicated herself to this job, sacrificed sleep, holidays, and personal time. And in less than 10 minutes, it was all over. Her legs suddenly felt weak. She turned, scanning the terminal, looking for... what? Help? Support? A miracle? Instead, her eyes landed on the very last person she wanted to see. Zayden Gray. He stood near a private car at the curb, speaking with another executive, his posture relaxed but authoritative. Amira was beside him, holding Cairo, who was still half asleep. The toddler nestled against his mother's shoulder, his tiny fingers gripping the fabric of her coat. Zayden wasn't even looking at her. She was invisible. She wanted to scream. She wanted to march up to him, demand that he see her, demand that he understand how much she had given to this company. But that wouldn't change anything. She knew that. Instead, she watched as Amira shifted slightly, whispering something to her husband. Zayden nodded, reaching out to stroke Cairo's back gently before glancing toward the driver. The man opened the door, stepping aside as Amira carefully slid into the car with their son. Zayden followed, pausing just before stepping inside. For the briefest moment, he turned his head toward the terminal. Their eyes met. Ms. Whitmore's breath caught in her throat. It lasted only a second. Then, without a word, Zayden stepped into the car, and the door shut behind him. The black sedan pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the stream of traffic. And just like that, he was gone. And she was left standing there, in the cold, watching as the last remnants of the life she had built slipped right through her fingers. Ms. Whitmore stood at the curb long after the black sedan had disappeared into the flow of airport traffic. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts churned, a chaotic spiral of regret, fear, and disbelief. How had this happened? She had walked onto that flight with authority, with control. Now she stood on the outside, stripped of everything she had worked for, as if the last 10 years of her life had never happened. Passengers continued flowing in and out of the terminal, moving forward with their lives while she remained frozen. A group of flight attendants passed by, laughing about something one of them had said. Their crisp uniforms were identical to the one she still wore, except they still belonged in theirs. Her uniform meant nothing now. A fresh wave of nausea rose in her stomach. Think. There had to be something she could do. Damage control. That's what she needed. She yanked her phone from her pocket, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. There had to be someone, an executive she had worked under, a manager who owed her a favor, someone who could pull strings before this went too far. She found a name, James O'Connell. James was one of the senior HR executives, someone she had worked with for years. They had attended training sessions together, even spoken about policies over coffee in the break room. He had always respected her. He would listen. She pressed the call button, pressing the phone against her ear, her heart hammering. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then, click. Ms. Whitmore. Her breath caught. He sounded off. James, she said quickly. Listen, I know you've probably heard what happened. I have. His voice was firm, professional, distant. Her stomach twisted. I need to talk to you, she pressed. You know me. You know I would never. Ms. Whitmore. He cut her off, and this time his voice carried something even worse than disinterest. Finality. This is no longer in my hands. Her pulse pounded. What does that mean? A pause. Then, the words that shattered any hope she had left. Mr. Gray has already made his decision. She stumbled back a step, her breath catching in her throat. No, wait, she said, desperate now. I haven't even spoken to the board yet. How can he? James sighed. You don't understand, do you? His voice was calm, but there was something almost pitying in it. You're not dealing with an internal complaint. This isn't about protocol or policy violations anymore. You humiliated the wrong person, and now you're gone. She gripped the phone tighter. I haven't even had my review. There won't be one. Her breath hitched. James continued. The board will formally terminate your contract in the next 24 hours, but that's just a technicality. The decision has already been made. She felt like the ground beneath her was splitting open. This couldn't be happening. You don't know what it's like to work for someone like Zayden Gray, James said, lowering his voice slightly. He doesn't scream. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't need to. He just decides. And when he does, that's it. She shook her head, struggling to breathe. But there's nothing you can do, Ms. Whitmore. His tone was final. Silence stretched between them. Then, quietly, he added, For what it's worth, I'd start thinking about what comes next. A beep. The line went dead. Her hand dropped to her side, the phone slipping from her grasp, hitting the pavement with a soft clatter. She barely noticed. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, crushing, suffocating. It was over. Not just her job, not just her career, her reputation. Zayden Gray had erased her in a single decision, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her legs felt weak, and she stumbled toward a nearby bench, collapsing onto it. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind still racing for something, anything, that could fix this. But no solution came. She had spent years controlling situations like this, being the one with the authority, making the rules. And now, she had become the example. A warning to anyone who thought they were untouchable. She squeezed her eyes shut. This wasn't just losing a job. This was career death, and she had sentenced herself. The minutes blurred together as Ms. Whitmore sat on the bench, her hands gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing entirely. The weight of the conversation with James still rang in her ears. There won't be one. The decision has already been made. She had spent years believing she held power in the airline, that her position, her experience, and her reputation made her untouchable. But now, all of it had been torn away, reduced to a single, irreversible fact. She didn't matter anymore. Passengers continued to move in and out of the terminal, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. A group of pilots walked past, laughing about something, their neatly pressed uniforms a painful reminder of everything she had just lost. Nearby, another flight attendant, young, fresh, still hopeful, stood with a rolling suitcase chatting on her phone. Ms. Whitmore used to be like that, once, before she had let her pride destroy her. She leaned forward, pressing a hand against her forehead, breathing in through her nose to keep herself from spiraling further. There had to be a way out. She grabbed her phone again, ignoring the messages piling up, and opened her contacts. If James wouldn't help her, maybe someone else would. Her eyes landed on Elliot Haynes, a senior administrator, someone with real influence in the executive offices. She had spoken to him at corporate events, even sat next to him during a leadership conference. They weren't exactly friends, but she had always considered him an ally in the company. If anyone could reason with Zayden Gray, it was him. Her fingers hovered over the call button, hesitating for only a moment before she pressed it. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, he answered. Elliot speaking. Relief flooded her chest. Elliot, thank God, I can't talk right now. His tone was clipped, hurried. Wait, please, she blurted. You have to help me. I need to talk to the board before they won't meet with you. His voice was flat, detached. Her stomach twisted. What? Elliot, this isn't about a board decision, Whitmore. The way he said her name, not Ms. Whitmore, just Whitmore, made her pulse spike. There was no warmth, no familiarity, just distance. He continued, his tone heavy. This is about Zayden Gray. The second he walked off that plane, your career was over. Her throat felt tight. But no, listen to me, he interrupted. You have no idea what kind of man you crossed. The panic inside her sharpened. I know exactly who he is, Elliot. That's why I'm calling you. No, Elliot said sharply. You don't. She froze. Elliot let out a slow breath like he was deciding whether he should even be having this conversation. Then he lowered his voice. Do you have any idea why Zayden Gray flies commercial instead of on private jets? She blinked. What? He's worth billions, Elliot continued. He owns a fleet of private aircraft. He could have pilots on standby for him at any moment. But instead he chooses to fly commercial. Do you know why? She swallowed. Because to test us, Elliot cut her off. To see how his passengers are treated. To make sure every employee in his airline holds up to the standards he built. He let out a humorless chuckle. And you? You just failed in front of the one person you couldn't afford to disappoint. Her hands clenched into fists. Elliot, please. I just need one chance to... No. His voice was final. There's nothing left to save. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then he exhaled sharply. Listen, I'm only telling you this because we've known each other a long time. Get ahead of this before it spreads further. Leave quietly. If you try to fight this, if you push back, if you go to the press, I would never. If you do, Elliot pressed, ignoring her interruption. Zayden will make sure you never work in aviation again. A lump formed in her throat. Elliot sighed. I'm sorry, Whitmore. But you need to accept it. This isn't just a job loss. A pause. You're done. Click. The line went dead. She stared at her phone, her fingers trembling. She was done. Not just at the airline, not just in first-class service, everywhere. Zayden Gray wasn't just punishing her. He was erasing her. Her body felt numb as she lowered the phone, her mind racing through what Elliot had just said. He was right. Zayden could have been anywhere. A private jet, a high-profile business lounge, away from the chaos of commercial travel. But he chose to be among the passengers. She had spent years believing she had authority, that she had power. But real power belonged to men like him, and the worst part? He didn't have to yell. He didn't have to argue. All he had to do was decide, and he had already made his choice. The realization was suffocating. She looked around, the weight of her new reality crashing down on her. She was no longer Ms. Whitmore, first-class cabin supervisor. She was just Whitmore, a disgraced former employee, standing alone at an airport curb, and nobody cared. Nobody was coming to save her. There were no favors to call in, no second chances, no appeals. She was finished. A cold gust of wind hit her face, stinging her skin. The airport moved on. The world moved on. And she had nowhere left to go. Ms. Whitmore sat on the bench, staring at the pavement as the weight of everything sank deeper. Her hands, once steady and authoritative, now trembled in her lap. She had spent the last decade enforcing rules, setting standards, making sure people knew she was in charge. And now she was the one being cast aside. Her phone buzzed again, a new notification. Her heart leapt, hoping for something, anything that would change the situation. Maybe a message from an old colleague, maybe someone offering a solution. But when she unlocked the screen, her stomach dropped. Airline statement, internal investigation underway. The airline had already released a public statement. Her breath came short and shallow as she clicked on the link. The article loaded quickly, and her eyes darted over the words, her pulse hammering with every sentence. Following an in-flight incident involving one of our senior flight attendants, the airline has launched a full internal review. We are committed to maintaining the highest standards of passenger care and will take appropriate action following the completion of our investigation. No name, no specifics, but it didn't need them. Everyone in the industry would know exactly who the statement was about, and if they didn't, the comments below the article made it painfully clear. If she put hands on a kid, she deserves whatever's coming. Unbelievable. First-class service is supposed to be professional, not abusive. Firing isn't enough. She should be banned from flying entirely. Her fingers tightened around her phone. There were hundreds of comments already. Her disgrace was now public, and it wasn't stopping there. She scrolled down, only to find screenshots. Someone had leaked the footage. It wasn't from the official airline cameras. Those were secured. But passengers had filmed it. A grainy, slightly angled video capturing the exact moment she had lost everything. The slap, the stunned silence, the way Amira had held her son tighter, as if shielding him from her. It was all there. And worse, the video was going viral. Her breath hitched as she scrolled faster, searching for something, anything that could make this stop. But the damage had already been done. This wasn't just about losing a job. This was about losing her name. She had seen public scandals like this before. Other flight attendants caught in heated arguments. Customer service workers making mistakes that spiraled out of control. Some had bounced back. Others had faded into nothing. She wasn't going to bounce back from this. Her hands felt numb as she set the phone down beside her. The world around her kept moving. Passengers wheeling luggage, taxis pulling up, airport staff chatting as they went about their routines. Nobody was looking at her, not yet. But they would. Any minute now, people would start recognizing her face. They'd stare, whisper, maybe even pull out their phones and snap a picture. The thought sent ice through her veins. She had to get out of here. With shaky hands, she grabbed her bag, stuffing her phone inside as she stood. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk toward the taxi stand. She needed to go somewhere, anywhere, just away from the airport, away from the stairs, away from the walls that felt like they were closing in on her. She reached the curb just as a cab pulled up. Without hesitation, she yanked open the door and climbed inside, her breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Where to?" She opened her mouth, then froze. Where was she supposed to go? For years, the answer had been simple. If she wasn't flying, she was at home, waiting for her next assignment. The airport had been her second home, the airline her entire identity. But now, she had nowhere. Her apartment, paid for by her salary, would soon be out of reach. Her career, her purpose, was gone, and she had no backup plan. She had never planned for failure, because she had never thought it would happen to her. "Miss?" the driver asked again, pulling her out of her daze. Her fingers tightened in her lap. "Just drive." The driver frowned but shifted the car into gear, pulling away from the curb. The airport grew smaller in the rearview mirror, fading into the distance. She had walked into that building with everything, and now she was leaving with nothing. The realization made her stomach turn. She was officially a nobody, and there was no coming back from this. The taxi moved through the city streets, but Ms. Whitmore barely noticed the changing scenery. The weight of everything pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She gripped her bag tightly, staring out of the window as the lights blurred past. Her mind was stuck in a loop. The slap, the silence, the way Amira had held Cairo like she was protecting him from a monster. And then Zayden, the way he had barely even raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. His presence alone had been enough to shift the entire flight against her. He hadn't argued with her, hadn't threatened her. He had simply decided her fate, and everyone had followed. That was true power, and she had never had it. For years she had thought she did. She had enforced rules, made passengers feel like she was in control, made decisions without hesitation. But she had been wrong. The real power had always belonged to the people who could end her with a single word. And now, Zayden Gray had done just that. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone again. She wasn't even sure why. There was no one left to call, no one who could help her. But some desperate part of her needed to see if there was a way out. She tapped on her email. More messages had flooded in, some from co-workers, some from people she barely even knew, sending her nothing but a short text. "Saw the video. Good luck. You messed up bad. They're talking about you everywhere." She clenched her jaw and scrolled faster, past the emails from HR, past the notifications from social media, until she saw something that made her heart nearly stop. Zayden Gray has released a statement. Her fingers trembled as she clicked on the link. The article loaded, and there it was. Statement from Zayden Gray, CEO of Skyline Airlines. At Skyline Airlines, we uphold the highest standard of service and professionalism. The safety and comfort of our passengers are our top priorities, and we do not tolerate misconduct of any kind. As a result of the recent in-flight incident involving one of our crew members, decisive action has been taken to ensure that such behavior does not reflect on the values of this airline. We remain committed to providing an exceptional experience for all travelers and maintaining the trust of our customers. She read it once, then twice. Nowhere in the statement did he mention her name, but he didn't have to. Her erasure had already begun. There was no talk of suspension, no mention of review, no internal investigation. Zayden Gray had already made it clear. She wasn't coming back. And now, every airline in the industry would see this. Every potential employer would know that she had been publicly discarded by one of the most powerful figures in aviation. Her name would be whispered in break rooms. Her mistake would be a lesson to every flight attendant in training. This wasn't just about being fired. This was about being permanently marked. She had spent her entire career climbing her way up, making sure people respected her, making sure passengers understood that she was the one in charge. And now, she was just a story, a cautionary tale. Her hands curled into fists. She needed to do something. She couldn't just sit back and let this happen. Maybe she could go to the press, tell her side, But then she thought about Elliot's warning. If you go to the press, Zayden will make sure you never work in aviation again. Her pulse pounded. That was exactly what was happening now, and he hadn't even needed to lift a finger. If she fought back, it would only get worse. She sucked in a sharp breath, blinking rapidly. She had to be smart. She had to think. But what options were left? She scrolled through her contacts again, searching for someone, anyone, who might still be on her side. But as she went down the list, doubt crept in. Would they even answer? Would they risk their own careers by helping her? Probably not. She was tainted now. Her breath hitched, and for the first time since stepping off that flight, she felt something new. Not just panic, not just fear, but regret. Real, deep, gut-wrenching regret. Because no matter how much she wanted to believe otherwise, she knew the truth. This hadn't just happened because Zayden Gray was powerful. It had happened because she had done this to herself. She had crossed the line. She had let her ego, her impatience, and her own self-importance blind her. She had hit a child, and now she was paying the price. Her fingers went limp, and her phone slid onto the seat beside her. The taxi kept moving, the city lights flashing past. She had no destination, no plan, no future. She had spent her whole life thinking she was above everyone else. Now, she was beneath them all, and for the first time in her life, she had no way back up. The taxi moved through the city, the glow of passing streetlights casting long shadows across Ms. Whitmore's face. She stared at her reflection in the window, but the woman looking back at her wasn't the same one who had boarded that plane just hours ago. That woman had been confident, in control, secure in her position. This woman was lost. She could still hear the echoes of her own voice from earlier that day, telling passengers to follow procedures, making sure the flight ran smoothly, believing she was the one in charge. But in reality, she had never been the one in control. The power she had once wielded had been an illusion, one that had shattered the moment she had crossed the wrong person. Zayden Gray had spoken, and now she didn't just lose her job. She had lost everything. The taxi driver glanced at her through the mirror. "Miss?" She didn't respond right away, her mind still spinning. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with slight impatience. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because she didn't know. For years, her life had been a constant routine of flights, layovers, and schedules dictated by the airline. She had always had somewhere to go, somewhere to be. Now, for the first time in her life, there was no destination. She reached for her phone again, but she already knew there were no messages, no opportunities waiting, no calls offering help. No one was coming to save her. Her fingers hovered over her contacts. She could call her family, her sister maybe. But then what? Admit that she had ruined her career? That she was at risk of losing everything she had spent years building? Her pride wouldn't let her. She could try reaching out to someone from the airline, maybe a former colleague. But after the leaked video, the public statement, and the countless online discussions tearing her apart, would anyone risk associating with her? She had burned every bridge. She clenched her jaw, willing herself to think logically. She still had some savings. Not much, but enough to last her a few months if she budgeted carefully. But after that, the aviation industry was small. Airlines shared information. The wrong reputation could follow someone for years. And a black mark from Zayden Gray? That wasn't something she could recover from. She thought about the passengers who had been on that flight. Did they even remember her name? Did they care? To them, she was just the disgraced flight attendant, a cautionary tale, a trending topic for a few days. Then they would move on. But for her, this wasn't just a moment. This was her entire life. Gone. She gritted her teeth, gripping the phone so tightly that her fingers ached. This wasn't fair. One mistake. That's all it had taken to destroy everything. But deep down, she knew it hadn't been just one mistake. This had been building for years. The attitude, the arrogance, the belief that she was untouchable. She had treated passengers as inconveniences instead of people. She had seen herself as a gatekeeper to first-class service rather than someone meant to serve. And today, she had gone too far. She had made the mistake, the kind that couldn't be undone. Zayden Gray hadn't just punished her. He had made an example out of her, and the worst part? He hadn't needed to yell, argue, or even fight to do it. All he had done was walk away. And in that moment, her fate had been sealed. She let out a shaky breath, finally answering the taxi driver's question. "Take me to a hotel," she murmured. The driver gave a small nod and turned down a new street. She stared back out the window, her mind blank. She needed time to think, time to figure out her next move. But as the city lights flickered past her, she knew one thing for certain. Her life, as she had known it, was over. She had spent years believing she was above the rules. Now, she was just another person who had been left behind, and there was nothing she could do about it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more.